All right, welcome to Coach Cloaker's Classroom. Today we're going to be talking about the Gilded Age. Now, this is a time in the United States where the U.S. is entering a new era post-Civil War, post-slavery, into what is most commonly referred to as the Industrial Revolution. Now, the term Gilded Age is a term you need to understand what gilded means. It's very shiny, polished, super duper pretty on the outside, and on the inside, it is going to be cheap, poorly made, dark, and dingy. If you go to a Walmart and buy a gold watch, it might be 2 millimeters of gold actually thick, and then below it might be plastic, it might be steel. So, in the Gilded Age, there's some terms you need to be aware of, but that understanding what gilded means will set us as a tempo for the unit. Now, the terms that we need to be aware of, we need to know inventing and innovation. We're very familiar with the idea of inventing. It's when someone creates a completely new product, as opposed to innovation, where we're taking a pre-made product and making it better. If we think about cell phones, how we've gone from a rotary landline, which is stationary in the house, all the way to a phone that can fit inside your pocket. Now, the Gilded Age is going to be seeing much industrial growth. A lot of this is with entrepreneurs, someone who creates and runs and builds their own business, trying to make a living. They're going to be very much at work in the Gilded Age. A lot of the work is going to be driven by immigrants coming from Europe, and we'll get this term free enterprise, which is where the company can decide what they want to make and sell, as opposed to a command economy where the government decides what a business will make and sell. This goes hand in hand with the term laissez-faire. Kind of sounds like lazy, and in a way it is, like a lazy government where they say we're not going to intervene in the day-to-day operations of businesses. But this is not always the case. The government will step forward and implement protective tariffs. A tariff, if you do not remember, is a tax on an imported good. If you have Ford made in the United States versus Toyota made in Japan, a Toyota is going to be cheaper than a Ford because they're made cheaper and more effectively. However, when they are imported into the United States, the government places a tax on the Toyota car to make it compatible with cars made in the United States. Now, with inventing and innovation, we get the term patent, which is where the government steps forward and sets a legal right and to say that the inventor made that idea and that is theirs. This is very similar to the idea of a trademark, like Mickey Mouse is trademarked by Disney for a few more years before he becomes public domain. An example of a patent is going to be Thomas Edison inventing the light bulb. Now, if you've ever heard the term you're burning daylight, meaning that you're killing time, you're wasting time, this is kind of that era where people are forced to work by candlelight for most of the time. And when it gets too dark and you don't have enough sunlight, people go home. You burn daylight. The light bulb changes this because it lights up insides of buildings so people can now work, companies can stay open longer because people can see their way about. Now, Henry Bessemer is going to invent the process of making steel. As you can see here on the screen, you have the external view of what a Bessemer furnace would look like, and then the inside. Now, steel is useful as it's more durable and it will last longer than iron. If you just think about your kitchen, you might have one or two cast iron skillets, but most of them are going to be made out of aluminum or stainless steel. It's more effective, lasts longer, and is more useful. The telegraph is going to be something that we need to know for this era, invented by Samuel Morse, sending a series of dots and dashes through a telegraph wire. Now, here I know they have people who've spent years of their lives dedicated in understanding Morse code. People trained for years in order to be a telegraph operator. I personally don't think I could do it because if you sent a bunch of dots and dashes at me, I would not know whether you typed hi dot or if you had typed something else like is dot. I wouldn't know. That's just me. I know people train for it. I don't think I could have done it. We innovate off of the telegraph, the first form of texting, to the telephone, where we can get on the phone and speak to someone and hear their voice. If you look at the bottom of your timeline, Alexander Graham Bell's first telephone, all the way to the phone of the 90s. And now we even have a telephone that can sit in your pocket comfortably and connect to the internet and worldwide services. Moving off of the telephone, it's not just enough that we can call someone up in the middle of the day. Now, we can go see them in the automobile developed by Carl Benz. Now, this probably sounds familiar if you've ever heard of Mercedes Benz. The car, as you can see in the picture, is not very sturdy. It has 3 wheels. There's no cover, so if it rains, you're going to get wet. You're going to fly into every bug because there's no windshield. The crank on the front for steering looks kind of scary, to be honest. And most importantly, there's no seatbelt, so if you hit something, you're going to be flying through the air. Now, that's more of a city aspect. In the country aspect, we get the development of a steel plow by this man named John Deere, who I'm sure you're familiar with. A plow being pulled by an ox or a horse will till the ground so that way farmers can plant and grow crops feeding America. We see the McCormick Reaper for after you plow the ground, where we can cut and bundle grains. This leads to a point where people are now losing their jobs because you can harvest acres of land quicker by using a reaper than you can by manpower. So people are losing their jobs due to mechanization, and they are moving to the city. Now, we've talked a lot about farmers. We're going to talk about ranchers here for a minute. So this man named Gustavus Swift is going to be responsible for innovating and really producing the first mainstream refrigerators or refrigeration. It starts out as an ice machine, and then people are like, what if we put a steak in it? I wonder if that would work. And needless to say, we have now developed 2 refrigerators that were first used to transport beef from place to place. Now, with all this inventing that goes on, we are going to have an era of big business. So, big businesses are on the rise. People are going to become vastly wealthy. Families are going to be running these, and it's going to be passed down from generation to generation. The railroads will change this as companies will start to be made and combined to make corporations. If you think that someone has a shop and you also have a shop, you can combine and make a corporation, thus cutting down on expenses and increasing profits. Some of these are going to make a cartel. This is where the word comes from, where a corporation agrees to set a limit of what's going to be produced and what they're going to be sold for. Okay, the De Beers brothers are an example of this, where they set the amount of diamonds on the market to keep prices high. Drug cartels in the United States and Mexico work the very same way. You set a limit for what is produced to keep prices high. If you think about the iPhone or any new cell phone when it comes out, there are only a few, so it's very expensive. But as more and more people get the iPhone 12 or the iPhone 25, the price will go down and down. People are always looking for innovating and improving off of businesses. And so we get these two terms, which is vertical and horizontal integration. Horizontal integration is going to be where a company buys all of the same or same level. Okay, as you can see in the image, you buy one oil refiner, then you buy another. If you are a butcher, you're going to buy another butcher shop. Okay, and then you'll buy another butcher shop, and all of the butcher shops will eventually be under your control. This is where we get the term monopoly from. There's one person controlling that product or service. Think about the Monopoly game. You buy all the railroads. Okay, then you have a monopoly over the railroads. This other term that we'll talk about is known as vertical integration. Okay, this is where you buy products from the ground up. Okay, if you are that butcher shop that we talked about, you'll start buying railroad cars, slaughterhouses, and cattle all the way up. Okay, so you can control the product from the farm to the table. Andrew Carnegie, who was famous for steel, we'll talk about him here in a little bit, runs and operates steel mills. He'll start buying railroads, he'll start buying the mines, and he'll start controlling all the lines of production for steel. Now, horizontal or integration requires trust because you are operating, let's say, all of the warehouses for meat, all of the butcher shops. You need a group of people to run that. Vertical integration is a lot more manageable under one person. Okay, you're controlling the line of the cattle to the slaughterhouse, through the railroads, to the warehouses, to the packing plants, to the shops. Okay, it's much more streamlined. And we get this term, which we'll see, which is robber barons versus captains of industry. Now let's talk about those two terms. A robber baron in this term is going to be someone who becomes very wealthy off of these processes and won't do much with their money, as opposed to a captain of industry who is going to work on improving the industry either through technologies or is going to give away or donate lots of income. One of the famous robber barons, there's going to be four that we talk about today, is Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie Hall. He will become the richest man, one of the richest men in America, mostly by paying his workers low salaries. We'll go a little bit more in depth on a later date. So Carnegie, while he makes lots of money, does subscribe to the gospel of wealth, that God made people wealthy with the responsibility of helping the poor and their fellow human beings. So he becomes a philanthropist, donating millions and millions of dollars to help building universities, libraries. He donates to Duke, to Stanford, to name two. You also hear this term philanthropist in the movie Avengers when Captain America is arguing with Iron Man on what they exactly are. Other robber barons that we'll talk about is Rockefeller, the inventor of Standard Oil, the granddaddy of all oil companies in America and England. the richest man in America. Now, some people say money can buy happiness and they would love to trade place with Rockefeller. Here's some things you need to think about. While Rockefeller was the richest man in America, he could not text or email his family and friends. He could not cool down his house through the use of air conditioning, as it has not been invented yet. He did not own a car, so he could not travel far places. He had to take a carriage to a train station and then a train elsewhere. And lastly, the medicine used to save his son's life hadn't been invented yet. So there's lots of things you have to think about. Yes, while he was the richest man in the world, that doesn't mean that he had life better than we do now. Another robber baron that we'll talk about is this man, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and I'm sure you've heard that last name before. If you have not, then you need to be aware that he is responsible for Vanderbilt University in Tennessee. He's a robber baron as he creates much wealth off of the use and creation of railroads. Carnegie, who we already talked about a little bit ago with steel, and J.P. Morgan will become wealthy off of creating and buying banks. And if you ask me, he looks like Mario if he took his hat off. So J.P. Morgan becomes wealthy in finance. He also does things as selling faulty arms to Union generals during the Civil War to make about $14 million. Now, with all of this, the government does decide to step in with all the monopolies going on. The first thing they do is they create the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission. Congress tries to say that it should be the same wherever you ship your products through. It should be measured off distance. If here in Texas, you shouldn't have to pay more to send your goods through Oklahoma than you would through Arkansas or Louisiana. It should be based off of distance. Brilliant idea. The government also creates the Sherman Antitrust Act. Remember, a trust is a board that runs a monopoly. The idea that if a monopoly is too powerful, then it needs to be broken up. So for the first 10 years that we have this law, we don't actually ever break it up. If you look on this image here on the right, these are the trusts along the wall. Okay, Standard Oil being right here, one of the fattest, and the steel on the far right. And here you have the congressman arguing down below and looking kind of scared. Child labor laws are non-existent in this time. Women are going to be bread makers along with children, breadwinners for their family. We've talked about vertical integration where people are buying, all of the lines of goods from farm to table. We also have companies that will buy up all of the services and goods in a town. So the company might own the mine. They'll also own the hotel and all the houses. They'll own the shop. They'll own the tailor. And so for you to get your uniform, to live and to eat, you are paying your paycheck right back to them. If we look at this photo, you can tell there's very little safety regulations. She is not wearing any shoes. It's kind of dark. Bad things happen. People get injured on the job. This leads to poor conditions, lead to unions. We have two major unions that we need to talk about, the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor. The Knights of Labor are going to push for an 8-hour workday. 8 hours. Nowadays, that's a pretty standard time. Back then, it was from sunrise to sunset. And it wasn't just a organization in the United States. On the other hand, we have the American Federation of Labor, who want improved pay, less working hours, and safer working conditions. In other words, they wanted to put guardrails on the Death Star so people didn't fall off needlessly to their deaths and get injured. This is not always successful. As a matter of fact, the unhappy workers led by unions would usually go on strike where someone refuses to work. And unfortunately, they end in violence. We'll talk about three major ones right here. The Pullman strike. A Pullman is an old-timey word for a mailman or mailwoman. The government will cut their pay by 25%. Workers will go on strike. And the president will put troops and force them back to work, saying it's illegal to stop the mail, even though they just cut their pay. The homestead strike, where at one of Carnegie's mills, Carnegie will hire his own private police force, the Pinkerton Police Force, also seen on the video games Red Dead Redemption, where they will force people to go back to work and to hunt down those that cause havoc and monetary loss for robber barons. Lastly, we have the Haymarket strike, where workers went on strike and ended up in an altercation with the police where a striker threw a bomb, killing a policeman. They would arrest and future execute 4 in that officer's murder. Now we're moving on. We're almost done. We have 2 more things that I want to talk about, 2 more topics. The first being the new immigrants to the United States. We talked about this briefly. We're going to go a little bit more in depth here. Immigrants have always been coming to America for better conditions. At the bottom of the Statue of Liberty, it says, "Give me you're tired, you're poor, and you're weary, not you're rich, you're wealthy, and you're well endowed." Immigrants coming before the Civil War, mostly from Western Europe, French, Germans, and English. Once they get settled in, the new immigrants post-Civil War that are mostly coming in are from Germany, Poland, Russia, and are going to be predominantly Catholic or Jewish, and so they're not going to blend or mesh well with the current immigrants and current citizens of the United States. Now, if you're coming into the U.S. at this time from Europe, you had 2 points of interest: Ellis Island on New York, where people were inspected and given an intelligence test. Yes, now here's how this worked. We're going to give you a test, and you might be a surgeon in Germany, but because you cannot read English and you failed this test, you're going to be labeled as mentally handicapped, which is terrible. So we give immigrants coming into the United States tests that are in English to then judge their intelligence to try and find them work. If you're coming to the United States from Asia, you're going to go to Angel Island, okay, where the similar process is going to be used for immigrants coming from Asia. Now, once you get here, it's not all fun and games. Jacob Riis published a book, How the Other Half Live, where he talked about families being crammed into apartment rooms. Not apartment buildings, apartment rooms. You look at this photo, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, kid behind the dad. That's 5, 6, 7, 8 people in a tiny room with 3 beds. It's going to be very crowded. If you've seen the movie West Side Story, this is another example of overcrowding into apartment buildings where they put several families in one apartment. They'll have to share bathrooms, showers, kitchens, living rooms. The cities did not have public sanitation, and so people would throw chamber pots and sewage out onto the streets. If you look on that bottom photo, there's children out there playing by what is a dead horse. Very awful picture, but it was daily life back in the 1890s. So the immigrants coming to the United States faced extreme prejudice by native-born Americans, where we get this term nativism. Now we understand that native is someone who was originally there. So this term applies to native-born Americans, not Native Americans, as in American Indians. Native-born Americans aren't a fan of the new immigrants coming to the United States. And we even go so far as, for the first time ever, Congress passing a law stopping immigrants from coming into the United States based off of their nationality and ethnicity. This being the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Chinese citizens won't be able to work. They'll be deported in mass numbers, and they will not be allowed to have citizenship or have any rights while living in the United States. Now, all this is run by corrupt political machines like Tammany Hall in New York. Now, we've talked about what Gilded meant at the start. I'm going to remind y'all it's glittery on the outside and very little value on the inside. Corrupt politicians are going to be running cities and states, stealing millions of dollars. For example, Bossman Tweed on the right side, who took bribes for political favors and would go into poor communities and promise that he would provide food, fuel, and jobs for their votes. In some sense, isn't this what politicians do now? Promise food, fuel, and jobs for votes? Joe Biden promised voters in Georgia a check for $2,000 if they voted. Boss William Tweed will be arrested when he is busted for political corruption, although this takes very, very long for that to happen, and he'll spend his last few years in jail. Okay, the last topic we're going to talk about is westward expansion. Now, we finally connected the East and the West through the Transcontinental Railroad, linking New York to San Francisco. Nowadays, you can rollerblade between the two cities. It might take you a few days, of course, but you can do it. And it connects the two markets from East and West. We look up to Canada and Alaska, and we see a valuable resource. We see gold. And so much like we sent thousands and millions of immigrants to California for the gold rush, we find gold in Canada and Alaska, and we start booking our way up there, searching for gold. Towns pop up overnight. People will starve. People will freeze to death. A few will strike it rich, but many will unfortunately perish in mines, and fewer will become wealthy from the gold rush. Now, as people are flocking west, we have the Homestead Act, where the government will give you 160 acres of land if you farm it for 5 years, dig a well, and build a road on it. So, in other words, make it home. But as people are using this Homestead Act, Congress is also selling land to squatters, people who have just set up shop on land. The government will start selling it to them to make some kind of profit. Most of the land in the Homestead Act is in Iowa and Nebraska. There'll be a few places in Wyoming and Colorado. But now something more that you may be familiar with. The cattle boom in Texas is going to play a role. Cattle in Texas wandering freely. The Chisholm Trail Drive, bringing cattle from Texas to the railroads in Kansas. Cowboys are going to work for little pay. It's going to be very dangerous, very lonely. Here's another thing. Most of these guys are Civil War veterans, and so they're out working with other Civil War veterans who might not like the fact that you were on the other side, so that poses a little bit of a problem. And then we get the invention of barbed wire, where barbed wire becomes famous as the inventor sets up a challenge where he says, I will set up a barbed wire fence either on my land or I will come to you, and I will give you and your ranch $5,000 if your cow breaks the fence. So people from all over the world tried, but no cow was willing to break the fence, and this went on for several years. So the last subtopic we're going to talk about is the issue with Native Americans. People are moving out west in vast numbers, and this forces Native Americans into a little bit of a tight spot. So the government will give Native Americans land in the Dawes Act if they assimilate. They'll drive Native Americans that don't into reservations so other people can take their land for ranchers, for gold. And so it's a clear notion that the United States misunderstood the Indian culture and the values and was looking at making a quick buck more than protecting American life. Thank y'all for tuning in on the Gilded Age. Next up in the series is going to be progressivism. Okay, I look forward to seeing y'all out there and listening to the video. Take care, stay safe. I love you. I'm proud of y'all. Don't do nothing illegal. Till next time.